I want you to imagine something for a second. Put yourself in this scenario. You are walking through a dry, sun-drenched mountain forest somewhere in the American West.
Oh yeah, the air out there is incredible.
Right, exactly. So the ground under your boots is crunching with dry fallen needles. The air is incredibly crisp and maybe a little thin depending on your elevation. And then suddenly you catch this unmistakable, almost bakery-like scent wafting through the air.
It is wild the first time you experience it.
You stop and you take a deep breath and you realize the middle of this wild forest smells exactly like warm vanilla.
Or butterscotch.
Yeah, butterscotch. And it is coming directly from the bark of the massive towering trees standing right in front of you.
It is one of the most surprising and wonderful sensory experiences you can have in the woods. I mean, people often think they are hallucinating it the first time it happens, but it is very real. And that scent belongs to an incredibly special organism.
Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we are focusing on one of the most widespread, economically vital, and ecologically fascinating trees in all of North America. We're taking a comprehensive look at the Ponderosa pine.
Known scientifically as Pinus ponderosa.
Pinus ponderosa, right?
It truly is a giant of the Western landscape. And what is so compelling about this specific tree is that its story is deeply intertwined with the history, the economy, and the incredibly complex ecology of the entire North American continent.
To really get to the bottom of how this tree operates, we have pulled together an absolute mountain of research for this deep dive. I mean, we are looking at extensive silvicultural data from the USDA Forest Service and their Southern Research Station.
Which covers the biology and growth habits in amazing detail.
Exactly. We also have commercial manufacturing and grading guidelines straight from the Softwood Export Council to understand the economics. We are incorporating horticultural pest insights from Earthwise Horticultural Strategy to figure out what exactly attacks this tree.
And there are a lot of things that attack it.
A terrifying amount. And to top it all off, we have a fascinating fire ecology transcript from the world of wildland fire.
It is a remarkably comprehensive stack of information we have today. It gives us this rare opportunity to look at a single organism from every possible angle. We can zoom all the way in on the microscopic genetics of its seeds and then zoom all the way out to understand how those genetics dictate the quality of the lumber that might be sitting in your living room right now.
And that brings us to our mission statement for today. Our goal is simple. By the end of this deep dive, you are going to be a true expert on the Ponderosa pine. You are going to understand exactly how this giant survives severe summer droughts, how it battles hundreds of different insect species.
How it actually uses raging wildfires to its own advantage.
Yes, and ultimately how it ends up as the beautiful honey-toned wood inside your homes.
If I had to provide an overarching thought to set the stage for a conversation today, it would be this. The Ponderosa pine represents the ultimate story of adaptation and resilience.
I like that.
It is a masterclass in evolving to meet the brutal demands of a specific, unforgiving environment. Every single feature of this tree, its thick bark, its incredibly deep roots, its needle structure, its internal chemistry, is a highly calculated biological response to the world it lives in.
Okay, let's unpack this, because when we use a word like giant, it is so easy to lose a sense of scale. I know these trees are considered massive, but what kind of scale are we actually talking about here? Let's start with the sheer anatomy.
We are looking at trees that frequently hit heights of 90 to 130 feet, just on an average healthy site.
Which is huge on its own.
Right, but those are just the everyday specimens. When you look at the record breakers, the absolute titans of the species, they can reach up to 232 feet. That is 70.7 meters tall.
That is almost impossible to picture in a forest setting. 232 feet. For you listening, if you want a mental image that is roughly the height of a 22-story skyscraper, just a solid tower of wood and needles stretching into the sky. And they aren't exactly skinny like a flagpole either, are they?
Not at all. Their girth is just as impressive as their height. When foresters measure these trees, they use a metric called diameter at breast height, which is exactly what it sounds like. It's the width of the trunk about 4.5 feet off the ground.
Okay, so at chest level.
Yeah. For mature ponderosas, that diameter is commonly 30 to 50 inches, but the record breakers, they have been measured at 103.5 inches across.
Wait, 103.5 inches. Let me do the math on that. That is a trunk over 8.5 feet wide.
It is massive.
You could park a full-size pickup truck behind it, and you wouldn't be able to see the truck.
Right.
And to get that big, they have to be incredibly old, right? I mean, they aren't just growing like weeds and dying young.
Exactly the opposite. They are playing the long game. These trees routinely live for 300 to 600 years.
Wow.
It requires a tremendous amount of time to pack on that much mass in environments that are often starved for water. If you're standing next to a 600-year-old Ponderosa today, you have to realize that tree sprouted from a seed back in the 1400s.
That is before Columbus.
Yeah. It has stood silently in that exact same spot through centuries of dramatic climate shifts, changing wildlife cycles, and the entirety of modern human history on this continent.
It's mind-boggling to think about. But beyond just being huge and old, they have these incredibly distinct visual and sensory identifiers.
Yeah.
If someone is walking through the woods tomorrow, how do they know they are looking at a ponderosa? Let's paint the visual picture first.
The bark is usually the dead giveaway. On a young tree, the bark is actually quite dark, almost black, which is why loggers historically called the younger ones blackjacks.
Blackjacks, okay.
But as the tree matures, the bark transforms into this striking orange, brown, or cinnamon color, and it doesn't stay smooth. It forms these large, flat, scaly plates.
I always think they look almost exactly like pieces of a jigsaw puzzle fitted together on the trunk.
That's a perfect description.
The fissures between the plates run deep, breaking the surface up into these massive interlocking shapes. And what about the canopy?
Out on the branches, you have distinctively long needles. They measure anywhere from 5 to 10 inches long. And here is a great identification trick for the amateur botanist. Ponderosa pine needles typically grow in bundles of 3.
Bundles of 3.
Right, botanists call these bundles fascicles. So if you pull a little cluster of needles off the twig, and there are 3 long needles bound together at the base, you are likely looking at a ponderosa.
And the cones?
The cones are substantial, usually about 3 to 6 inches long, and they are armed with very sharp, prickly scales. At the tip of every single scale on the cone is a small, stiff spine.
I've definitely grabbed one of those without looking.
Yeah, if you've ever picked one up casually, you've probably felt that sharp prickle. It is a very effective defense mechanism while the seeds are developing inside.
And then, of course, there is that signature smell we talked about right at the beginning, that bakery smell. What is actually causing that?
It all comes down to the tree's resin and the ambient temperature. When the bright, high-altitude sun hits that orange puzzle piece bark and warms it up, the complex chemicals inside the tree's sap, specifically the volatile organic compounds, begin to vaporize.
So they are literally baking in the sun.
They literally volatilize into the air around the trunk. The specific blend of chemicals in the ponderosa creates that distinct sweet scent of vanilla or butterscotch.
It is nature's air freshener. But where exactly are you going to find these vanilla-scented skyscrapers? If we were looking at a map of North America, what does the territory of the ponderosa look like?
It boasts one of the most extensive ranges of any conifer on the continent. It stretches all the way from southern Canada, specifically the Fraser River drainage up in British Columbia, and it plunges deep into Mexico.
And east to west?
Longitudinally, it ranges from the plain states like Nebraska and Oklahoma all the way west to the Pacific coast.
That is a massive footprint. But what really surprised me in the research is that it doesn't seem to care much about elevation. You can find it growing practically at sea level in places like Washington State where the air is thick and damp.
Right.
But then you travel down to the southern Rocky Mountains in places like Arizona or New Mexico, and this exact same species is thriving at 10,000 feet up in the thin, freezing alpine air. How is that even biologically possible?
That is a brilliant question, and that incredible geographic range is exactly what brings us to the genetic complexity of the species. Pinus ponderosa isn't just one monolithic identical clone pasted across all those thousands of miles.
So they aren't all exactly the same.
No, to survive in such vastly different climates, from the rainy, mild Pacific Northwest to the freezing, arid deserts of the Southwest, the tree has fractured into highly adapted geographic races.
So it's the same species, but they've tweaked their own internal blueprints depending on their zip code. The research breaks the species down into 2 main varieties. First, you have the Pacific Ponderosa pine, which is officially known as Pinus ponderosa variety ponderosa.
Correct.
And then you have the Rocky Mountain Ponderosa pine, which is the variety scopulorum. I also noticed a mention of the Arizona pine variety Arizonica, though it seems that one is sometimes grouped in but often recognized as its own separate species altogether.
Yes, the taxonomy can get a little dense there, but within those broad varieties, the genetic variations get even more specific and fascinating. The genetic data shows us there are actually 5 major geographic races of the ponderosa.
Walk us through those races because the differences are surprisingly pronounced.
Let's start with the Pacific variety. Within that, you have the Pacific race. These trees grow in relatively mild, wet climates. As a result, they grow rapidly. They produce the largest needles and the largest cones, but they are genetically the least cold hardy. They haven't needed to evolve extreme freezing tolerance.
Makes sense. If you live on the coast, you don't need a heavy winter coat.
Precisely. Then still within that western group, you have the North Plateau race. These trees face a slightly drier, harsher environment. They have open, plume-like foliage, but their secret weapon is at the microscopic level. They have specialized needles with sunken stomata.
Sunken stomata, what does that do?
Well, stomata are the tiny pores on a leaf that let the plant breathe, but they also lose water through them. By having sunken stomata recessed into the needle surface, the North Plateau race drastically reduces its water loss. It is a micro-adaptation for moisture retention.
That is brilliant engineering. And what about the third one in the west?
That is the Southern California race. What makes them genetically distinct isn't just their appearance, but their chemistry. They are distinguished by the specific types of monoterpenes they produce in their resin.
Let's pause right there, because for the listener who might not be a biochemist, what exactly is a monoterpene?
Great clarification. Monoterpenes are a class of organic compounds found in the essential oils of many plants, particularly conifers. They are the volatile chemicals that give pine trees their distinct piney smell, and they play a massive role in the tree's defense system against insects.
Oh, so it's a chemical weapon.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Different races of Ponderosa produce different blends of these chemicals. It is essentially a chemical fingerprint that tells scientists exactly where a specific tree's lineage comes from.
So the Southern California trees have a totally different chemical fingerprint than the trees up in Washington. What about the Rocky Mountain side of the family tree?
On that side, you have the Rocky Mountain race itself. Because they endure brutal freezing winters and short growing seasons, they are characterized by very compact foliage. They don't waste energy growing long, lush needles.
Conserving energy.
Right. In fact, they have a strong tendency to actually grow their needles in bundles of 2 rather than the typical 3 we discussed earlier. It is an energy-saving measure. And lastly, you have the southwestern race, which features open foliage and, again, its own highly unique identifiable resin composition.
Now, why does all this minute genetic mapping matter to you listening at home? Why do we care if a tree in California has different resin than a tree in Colorado? The research highlights something called common garden experiments, and this absolutely blew my mind. Can you walk us through what a common garden experiment actually is and what it proved about the Ponderosa?
It is one of the most elegant ways scientists study genetics. In a common garden experiment, researchers want to figure out if a plant's traits are caused by its immediate environment, like the soil and whether it happens to be sitting in, or if those traits are hard-coded into its DNA.
Okay, so nature versus nurture for trees.
Exactly. To do this, they essentially take seeds from different Ponderosa pines from all over the country. They gather seeds from the mild California coast, from the freezing South Dakota plains, from the high Arizona mountains.
So they gather all these geographically diverse seeds. Then what?
Then they plant them all together side by side in a single identical location, a common garden. In the specific study highlighted in the research, they planted all these diverse seeds in Michigan.
Oh, wow. Michigan winters are no joke.
No, they are not. So now every seedling is getting the exact same Michigan soil, the exact same Michigan sunlight, and the exact same freezing Michigan winter. If all the trees grow up to look identical, it means the environment dictates their traits. But if they grow up differently, it means those traits are locked in their genetics.
And what happened when winter hit Michigan?
The results were stark and incredibly telling. All the 2-year-old seedlings that grew from the California seeds suffered severe, devastating injury from the cold. Many of them died.
Just wiped out.
Yes. Their cellular walls literally burst because they hadn't evolved to harden off and go dormant early enough in the season. Meanwhile, the seedlings right next to them, which came from seeds gathered in places with harsher winters, survived the Michigan freeze just fine.
That is incredible. So what this proves is that these trees have spent millennia fine-tuning their internal blueprints to perfectly match the local elevations, temperatures, and moisture levels of their specific home territories.
You cannot simply take a Ponderosa seed from San Diego, stick it in the ground in South Dakota, and expect it to thrive. It doesn't have the genetic programming to survive the winter.
They have the exact coordinates of their ancestral home coded into their DNA. It is a level of hyper-specialization that is easy to miss when you just look at a map and see a big blob of green-labeled Ponderosa pine territory.
It really is.
But getting that perfectly coded DNA to actually sprout into a giant tree is a whole different battle. Which brings us to the brutal beginnings of the Ponderosa pine. You would think a tree that successfully dominates the entire western half of a continent would have a really easy time reproducing. Like it just drops seeds and boom, a new forest appears.
You would certainly assume that, but the reality is that natural regeneration for the ponderosa is incredibly sporadic. It is not a reliable year-over-year process. It is essentially a massive biological lottery.
A lottery.
Yes, for a new generation of trees to successfully take root, it requires a very specific, almost statistically improbable combination of events. First, the mature trees must produce a heavy crop of seeds, and second, that heavy seed crop has to be followed immediately by a year of highly favorable weather, particularly an abundance of moisture.
And those heavy seed crops are not a yearly guarantee, right? They don't just pump out 1,000,000 seeds every single autumn.
No, they operate on a masting cycle. Depending on the region, a truly abundant cone crop might only happen every 3 to 8 years. The trees spend years hoarding carbohydrates and energy, and then suddenly synchronized across the entire forest, they dump a massive amount of seeds all at once.
But even when they do drop that massive payload of seeds, those seeds are not great travelers. Some trees have those little helicopter seeds that blow miles away. Not the ponderosa. The research points out that ponderosa seeds are quite heavy.
Very heavy.
If you measure it out, only 8% of the seeds manage to flutter even 120 meters away from the edge of the parent forest. They essentially drop straight down into the danger zone.
And once they hit the ground, the odds of survival plummet even further. Because the seeds are quite large and packed with rich fats and proteins, they are highly nutritious, which means they are heavily preyed upon by almost everything in the forest. Mice, chipmunks, and tree squirrels consume astronomical quantities of them.
I read a detail about the squirrels that is honestly a little vindictive. They don't just wait for the seeds to fall.
They don't. Squirrels are known to climb up into the canopy and physically clip the cone-bearing twigs right off the tree. They drop the whole cluster to the ground to harvest later.
Sabotage.
In doing so, they destroy both the flowers and the developing conelets before they even have a chance to mature into viable seeds. Birds take a massive share as well. If it happens to be a year with a smaller seed crop, the local wildlife might easily consume nearly 100% of the potential new forest. Zero regeneration.
But let's play the lottery. Let's say a single seed gets incredibly lucky. It falls in a good spot, it evades the chipmunks, the squirrels miss it, and it gets just enough spring moisture. How does it actually grow? The term used in the sources is epigeal germination. For you listening, trying to picture this, what does that mean?
Plants generally have two ways of sprouting, hypogeal and epigeal. In hypogeal germination, think of a pea or an acorn. The seed leaves the cotyledons, stay buried safely underground while the shoot pushes up.
So they have an anchor.
Right. But the ponderosa relies on epigeal germination. This means the growing stem literally pushes the seed casing, and the tiny, fragile seed leaves up above the surface of the soil into the open air.
So this tiny, delicate green shoot is suddenly totally exposed to the elements. And in places like the American Southwest, those elements are brutal. What is the secret weapon? Because standing above ground in the desert sun seems like a quick way to die.
The absolute key to its survival in environments like the drought-prone Southwest is what it is doing underground while we aren't looking. This is where the ponderosa shows its true tenacity. In the Southwest, seeds often germinate during the summer monsoon rains.
Okay.
This means they are starting their fragile lives in July or August, when the surface temperatures of the soil can be well over 100 degrees Fahrenheit.
That is literally an oven.
It is. To survive, the seedling cannot waste time growing a lush canopy of needles. Instead, it pours all of its initial energy into driving a taproot straight down into the earth. It is literally racing to reach deep, permanent moisture before the scorching sun bakes the surface soil completely dry.
The numbers on this are staggering. Let's put this in perspective. Imagine you're planting a vegetable garden in your backyard. Now imagine your little tomato seeds having to battle 100-degree surface temperatures, zero rain for months, and hungry chipmunks. In loosened soil, a tiny, fragile-looking ponderosa seedling can punch a taproot 20 inches deep in just a few months.
It is incredible.
It pushes a root almost 2 feet straight down into hard dirt just to survive year one.
It is an incredible feat of biological energy allocation. And that aggressive root growth doesn't stop after year one. As they grow into mature trees, ponderosas can send taproots 35 to 40 feet deep into the earth. There are documented cases of foresters finding their roots navigating all the way down deep rock fissures, splitting boulders apart just to find a trickle of underground water. They are anchoring themselves into the very bedrock of the landscape.
They are absolute survivors. But there is one thing they absolutely cannot tolerate while they are doing all this miraculous growing, and that is shade. Ponderosa pines are highly intolerant of competition for sunlight. I like to think of it this way. Growing a ponderosa in a dense shaded understory is like trying to thrive in a crowded windowless room. They just shut down. They refuse to play the game.
The silvicultural data cites a fascinating long-term study from Central Oregon that illustrates this exact point perfectly. Researchers looked at young ponderosa trees growing in an area that was completely surrounded by thick understory shrubs like manzanita and snowbrush. So the young pines were facing heavy direct competition for light and soil moisture.
And how do they fare?
Miserably. Those crowded trees grew only 3.5 inches in diameter over an entire decade.
Oh, that's nothing.
But then the researchers looked at trees in the exact same area with the exact same soil and rain that had been cleared of that competitive ground cover. Those free-to-grow trees grew 4.7 inches in a decade.
That is a massive difference in growth rate. Over a century that dictates whether a tree becomes a giant or stays a stunted little pole. It all comes down to having a little elbow room and a clear view of the sun. But interestingly, while they demand premium sunlight, they do not demand premium soil. They are incredibly nutritionally efficient.
They really are. They thrive on poor, coarse-textured rocky soils where other competing tree species like Douglas fir or white fir would simply starve and fail. When scientists measure the critical boundaries for nutrients, meaning the bare minimum amount of a nutrient a tree needs in its leaves to sustain adequate growth, the ponderosa is exceptionally low.
What are the numbers on that starvation diet?
For nitrogen, the critical boundary is just 0.9% in their foliage. For phosphorus, it's a mere 0.08%. By the standards of almost any other major forest tree, ponderosa pines are surviving, thriving, and building 200-foot trunks on an absolute starvation diet. They extract every single usable atom from the rocks they grow on.
They are the ultimate survivalists. They beat the drought, they beat the poor soil, they beat the shade. But being a tough survivalist doesn't mean you don't have enemies. And the ponderosa pine has an absolute army of them. This brings us to the threat matrix.
What's fascinating here is just how extensive this rogues gallery is. When we talk about insects, the data indicates there are at least 108 distinct species of insects that actively attack the ponderosa variety and 59 distinct species that attack the scopularum variety.
Over 100 bugs.
It is a constant unseen war happening 24 hours a day in the forest canopy and beneath the bark.
It's staggering when you look at the threat matrix. This single species of tree is battling well over 100 distinct species of insects. Let's talk about the most lethal soldiers in that enemy army, the bark beetles. Specifically, the Dendroctonus species. The name literally translates to tree killer.
And they earn that name. You have the western pine beetle, which usually operates as a scavenger. It targets older declining or lightning-struck trees, but it won't hesitate to attack perfectly healthy, vigorous trees if a severe drought has weakened the forest's overall defenses.
And then you have the mountain pine beetle, which has a terrifying history of utter devastation. The research highlights a specific outbreak in the Black Hills of South Dakota right around the turn of the century between 1894 and 1908. In that single prolonged event, the mountain pine beetle killed between 1 and 2 billion board feet of ponderosa pine.
Let's contextualize that measurement for you listening, because board feet is an industry term. A board foot is a volume of wood that is 12 inches wide, 12 inches long, and 1 inch thick. It is the standard unit of lumber.
Okay, so a 1 foot square that's an inch thick.
Right. To lose 1 to 2 billion of those units in a single localized area is an almost unfathomable amount of mature timber destroyed by an insect the size of a grain of rice.
But how does a tiny bug that you can barely see take down a 200-foot giant? It's not just a million bugs taking tiny bites of wood until the tree falls over, right? It's much more sinister. It is a highly coordinated dual attack.
Exactly. The mortality is caused by a lethal combination of 2 biological factors. First, you have the beetle larvae. The adult female beetles bore through the thick outer bark and lay their eggs in the phloem.
What is the phloem visually if we cut the tree open?
Think of a tree trunk like a city. The thick, dead bark on the outside is the city wall. The solid wood in the dead center is just structural support. But just beneath the bark, there is a very thin living layer of tissue called the phloem and the cambium. This is the city's highway system.
Oh.
It is responsible for transporting sugary nutrients down from the needles and water up from the roots. When the beetle eggs hatch, the larvae essentially eat their way horizontally across these highways. They sever the circulatory system of the tree.
So they are starving the tree by cutting off the food supply. But you mentioned a dual attack. What is the second weapon?
The beetles also carry a secret symbiotic weapon, a blue stain fungus. When the adult beetles bore into the tree, Spores of this fungus are carried on their bodies and introduced into the living wood.
A biological weapon.
The fungus thrives in the moist environment of the trunk and spreads rapidly through the sapwood, physically blocking the microscopic tubes that carry water. So the tree is having its nutrient highways eaten by larvae, while simultaneously having its water pipes clogged by fungus.
It is an incredibly grim way to go. Choked and starved from the inside out. And the bark beetles aren't the only ones out there. You have the Ips species known as pine engravers. Now, the research says these usually breed in the slash leftover from logging. For the listener who hasn't worked a timber harvest, what exactly is slash?
Great question. When a logging operation comes through to harvest timber, they only want the main straight trunk of the tree. They cut off all the branches, the needles, the useless tops, and any deformed wood, and they leave it piled on the forest floor. That debris is called slash.
It's just left there.
Ips beetles love to breed in this freshly cut, defenseless wood. But if the logging slash isn't managed properly, the Ips population can explode to such massive numbers that they run out of slash and turn their invention to the healthy standing trees nearby.
They are opportunists. And then there are the insidious insects, the ones that don't kill the tree but just torture it, like the western pine shoot borer.
The pine shoot borer is particularly frustrating for forest managers because it doesn't kill the tree, it just sabotages its architecture. The larvae of this insect bore directly into the pith of the terminal shoot.
The very top one, right?
Yes, the terminal shoot is that single topmost vertical branch that dictates the tree's upward height growth. By eating the inside of that specific shoot, the larvae stunt the shoot's growth by over 25% in a single year. It permanently alters the tree's trajectory, making it crooked or stunted without ever dealing a fatal blow.
And we can't forget the diseases. It's not just a million tiny bugs chewing on them. Dwarf mistletoe is a massive problem. When you hear mistletoe, you think of a cute holiday decoration. But dwarf mistletoe is a vicious parasitic plant.
Very vicious.
It latches onto the branches of the ponderosa, sinks its roots into the tree's vascular system, and drains the tree's water and nutrients. It completely messes with the tree's growth hormones, causing these bizarre, hyperdense, tangled knots of branches called witch's brooms.
They look exactly like what they sound like. Large, chaotic nests of twigs, and they are heavy, sapping the tree's energy. In parts of Arizona, dwarf mistletoe infection is so severe, it is responsible for up to 36% of all ponderosa mortality.
You also have fungal diseases like Elytroderma deformans, which is a perennial needle cast. It attacks the needles, turning them brown and killing the foliage, robbing the tree of its ability to photosynthesize. And then you have the devastating root rots like black stain and anosis root disease.
These are awful.
These spread invisibly through the soil, moving from root system to root system, killing trees in large, expanding circular pockets. And of course, a tree suffering from root rot is weak, which paves the way for the bark beetles to swoop in and finish the job.
It is a gauntlet of biological threats. But we also have to look at the abiotic threats, things that aren't even alive. Air pollution and elevated ozone levels blowing in from heavily populated urban areas cause a physiological condition called chlorotic mottling.
Smog, basically.
Yeah, the ozone damages the cellular structure of the older needles, causing them to turn yellow and drop off prematurely. The tree literally loses its solar panels, starving it of energy and making it dangerously susceptible to the root rots and beetles. Even something as simple as unusually wet, heavy snow clinging to the needles can bend and forcefully snap the trunks of young pole-sized trees.
It really is a miracle any of them survived to be 600 years old. But as we discussed regarding the bark beetles, there was an underlying overarching factor that makes these trees highly susceptible to almost all of these threats, and that is stand density.
This is critical.
When forests become unnaturally overcrowded, the trees are forced into intense, desperate competition for limited soil water. They become deeply stressed, their vigor drops, and they lose their ability to produce enough sticky resin to physically pitch out or drown the boring beetles. An overcrowded forest is essentially laying out an all-you-can-eat buffet for a bark beetle outbreak.
This is a crucial ecological concept. Density dictates vulnerability.
Here's where it gets really interesting, because that exact issue of overcrowding ties directly into the most defining, spectacular element of the Ponderosa pine's existence: fire.
Yes.
This tree didn't just adapt to casually survive fire, it evolved over millennia to absolutely rely on it. The Ponderosa is widely considered one of the most fire-resistant conifers in the entire American West.
To understand how it survives a force of nature that incinerates other species, we have to look at the physical armor it has developed. And this defense system starts remarkably early in its life. When a young ponderosa is just 5 centimeters in diameter, barely the thickness of an adult's wrist, it already begins developing a specialized layer of corky bark.
Just 5 centimeters.
Cork is an incredible insulator, and this layer protects its vital inner tissues from the heat of low-intensity surface fires.
But the mature trees, the ones with that thick puzzle piece bark we talked about earlier, they have a mechanism that is almost sci-fi in how clever it is. It's like a spacecraft re-entering the Earth's atmosphere. When a fire sweeps through the forest floor and the flames lick up the trunk of a mature ponderosa, the outermost layers of that puzzle piece bark literally catch fire and then sloof off.
They pop right off.
They physically detach and shed away from the trunk, taking the intense localized heat with them, away from the living cambium layer inside.
It is exactly like the ablative heat shield on a space capsule. It is an active cooling system. And this armor is paired with the tree's habit of self-pruning. Have you ever noticed how a mature ponderosa looks like a giant broccoli stalk? It has a massive bare trunk with all the green needles clustered way at the top.
Yeah, they don't have branches all the way down to the ground like a spruce tree or a fir tree.
That is not an accident. As ponderosas age, they naturally cut off the nutrient supply to their lower branches, allowing them to die and drop off. This creates a clear, tall, branch-free bole or trunk. Ecologically, this effectively removes the ladder fuels.
Ladder fuels, I like that visual.
If a surface fire is burning in the grass, it has no branches to use as a ladder to climb from the ground up into the highly flammable needle canopy. Combine that self-pruning with those incredibly deep taproots we discussed, which are buried safely feet below the layer of soil that actually gets heated during a surface fire, and you have an absolute fortress of a tree.
But the key phrase there, the entire linchpin of this evolutionary strategy, is surface fire. To understand the ponderosa, you have to deeply understand its historical fire regime. Let's break down what a fire regime actually is for the listener, because it's not just fire happens randomly.
A fire regime is a way of describing the historical pattern of fire in a specific ecosystem. It encompasses several key factors: the frequency of the fires, meaning how often they happen; the seasonality, so what time of year they burn; their intensity, how hot they get; and their severity, how much vegetation they actually kill. Historically, before European colonization and modern forest management, the ponderosa forest, particularly in the Southwest, had a very specific, incredibly reliable fire regime.
What did that historical pattern look like? Let's put some numbers on it.
Low-intensity surface fires swept through these landscapes on a very regular basis. On average, every 10 years, with a recorded range anywhere from every single year up to about 35 years.
And these weren't accidents or tragedies. They were ignited primarily by dry lightning storms, which are a hallmark of summer weather in the West. But crucially, they were also intentionally set by indigenous peoples. Native populations used fire as a highly sophisticated vital tool to manage the landscape.
It was proactive management.
They burned to clear out dense brush, to make travel easier, to flesh out game for hunting, and to promote the growth of specific culturally important plants and grasses that thrive after a fire.
Because these fires happened so frequently, every decade or so, fuel never had a chance to build up to dangerous levels. There wasn't a century's worth of dead branches, thick pine needles, and dense thickets of young competing seedlings blanketing the ground. So when a fire did start, it crept along the ground low and relatively cool.
Like a campfire spreading out.
The flames might only be a foot or two high. These creeping fires would easily kill off the encroaching thin-barked shrubs and the small fire-sensitive trees like true firs. But they would wash right over those grand, thick-barked, self-pruned, mature ponderosa pines, leaving them completely unharmed.
The result of this constant cycle of creeping fire was a forest structure that early explorers described in their journals as park-like. It wasn't the dense, tangled, spooky, impenetrable jungle of trees we often picture today when we think of a wild forest. It was open. It looked almost like a manicured park or a meadow dotted with massive, widely spaced trees. The historical data estimates there were only 10 to 75 trees per acre, averaging around 33 trees per acre.
It was so open that early pioneers documented that you could literally ride a horse at a full gallop straight through these historic forests without hitting a low branch or being blocked by a thicket of brush.
That is an amazing mental image. But a skeptical listener might ask, how do we actually know that? Nobody was out there with a clipboard and a stopwatch 400 years ago tracking how often the grass burned. How do scientists know with such precision that fires happen exactly every 10 years?
We know this history so precisely because of dendrochronology, the scientific study of tree rings. The ponderosa pine is basically a giant living hard drive that records its own history. When a fire burns just hot enough to scorch and damage the living tissue under the bark, but not hot enough to kill the whole tree, it leaves a localized scar, often called a cat face, at the base of the trunk.
And what happens to that scar over time? Does it heal?
As the tree continues to grow in the years following the fire, it wraps new healthy wood around the edges of that dead scarred tissue. It compartmentalizes the wound. By taking physical cross-sections of these ancient trees, either from dead logs or by using a hollow increment bore on living trees, scientists can look at the rings. Every ring represents 1 year of growth.
So they literally just count backward from the bark to the center.
Exactly. They count the rings and suddenly they hit a black charcoal-lined scar buried deep in the wood. By cross-dating these ring patterns across hundreds of trees in an area, they can pinpoint not just the exact year of fire burned, but often the specific season it occurred.
How do they know the season?
Because a tree's growth ring has light, porous wood formed in the wet spring and dark, dense wood formed in the dry, late summer, scientists can see exactly where the fire scar interrupts the ring. If the scar is in the late summer wood, they know it was a fall fire. It is a literal living barcode of centuries of fire history.
It is brilliant detective work. But the landscape we see today, if you drive through the mountains in the west, looks very different from that historical barcode. It is not open and park-like. Over the last 140 years, human activity drastically and fundamentally altered that historical regime. Through a combination of 3 massive shifts, we changed the entire ecosystem. We have to report on these shifts based on the ecological data.
The first shift was the introduction of millions of head of livestock, cattle and sheep in the late 1800s. They severely overgrazed the landscape, literally eating the continuous layer of grasses that historically carried the low-intensity surface fires from tree to tree. Without the grass, the fire couldn't spread.
The second shift was intensive industrial logging. Early loggers didn't take the small, weak trees, they high-graded the forest, taking only the largest, oldest, most fire-resistant ponderosas, removing the very seed trees that had survived centuries of fire.
And the third and perhaps most impactful shift was the implementation of a strict, comprehensive governmental policy of fire exclusion. For over a century, the mandate was to extinguish every single wildfire as quickly as humanly possible, usually by 10 a.m. the next day. We viewed fires solely as an enemy to be defeated, rather than a natural process to be managed.
And while that policy was born out of a desire to protect resources, the ecological consequences of removing fire from a system that explicitly evolved to rely on fire are profound. Without those frequent low-intensity surface fires to act as nature's janitor and thinning agent, the forest became unnaturally, dangerously dense. We went from that historical average of 33 majestic trees per acre to forests choking with 300, 800, sometimes up to 1,500 small trees per acre.
Which brings us full circle back to the bark beetles and the devastating droughts. When you have 1,500 trees fighting for the exact same amount of soil water that used to support only 33 trees, the math doesn't work. Every single tree is stressed. Every single tree is thirsty, weak, and unable to produce the resin needed to fight off insects.
And it completely breaks the tree's fire armor. When you have a century's worth of dead wood dropped pine needles and a thick, impenetrable understory of small, spindly trees, you've created perfect fire ladders. So now when a lightning strike happens and a fire ignites during a hot, dry summer, it isn't a low-intensity creeping surface fire anymore. The abundant, unnatural fuel load allows the fire to burn with massive, terrifying intensity. The flames use those dense thickets of small trees to climb straight up into the forest canopy.
These modern, high-severity crown fires are completely different beasts than the historical surface fires. They jump from treetop to treetop, generating their own violent weather systems. They burn so intensely hot that they kill absolutely everything, boiling the sap inside the trunks. Even the ancient thick-barked ponderosas that successfully survived dozens of historical surface fires over the last 500 years cannot survive a modern crown fire. Their evolutionary armor is completely overwhelmed by the sheer thermal output.
The ecological data paints a very clear picture of this transition. In nature, completely removing a primary disturbance mechanism fundamentally changes the organism. And returning these specific forests to a balanced state where they can survive fire again requires active ecological management according to the fire ecologists. Things like prescribed, intentionally set fires during safe weather windows and mechanical thinning to physically remove those excess ladder fuels, giving these giants the breathing room they evolved to require.
If we connect this ecology to the bigger picture of human civilization, the entire biology of the Ponderosa pine is a testament to the fact that disturbance isn't inherently bad. And it is that exact biology, that slow, steady, resilient growth through drought and fire, that translates into the immense commercial value this tree holds for us today.
Let's transition from the wild-burning forest right into your living room, because the odds are incredibly high that you have interacted with Ponderosa pinewood products probably today. This tree is an absolute titan of the global timber and manufacturing market. Let's look at sheer economic data from just 1999 as a snapshot. Over 4.51 million cubic meters of Ponderosa pine were produced. It ranked third in total volume among western softwoods, right behind Douglas fir and hemfir. And here is the kicker. It ranks second in total commercial value.
It is a premium product. It commands a high price point. And the states leading that massive million cubic meter production are historically Oregon and California, which makes perfect sense given that those states are home to the massive trees produced by the Pacific and North Plateau races we discussed at the very beginning of the deep dive.
But what is it about this specific wood that makes it so valuable? Why do we want it in our homes more than other trees?
It really comes down to the physical properties of the wood itself, which are a direct physical result of how the tree grows over centuries. Because these trees grow so large and live for so long, they yield immense amounts of what's called sapwood. Let's explain that for the listener. If you cut a tree down and look at the stump, the wood is divided into two zones. The very center is the heartwood, which is often darker, denser, and technically dead. It just provides structural support. The outer ring of wood just beneath the bark is the sapwood. This is the younger wood that was actively transporting water. In the Ponderosa, the band of sapwood is extraordinarily wide, and it is this beautiful, creamy, white to straw yellow color. There is actually very little of the darker, reddish-brown heartwood in the center.
And aesthetically, people love that light color. But it's not just the color. The wood has a famously straight, uniform grain. It is very soft textured, and it carries that pleasant, slightly resinous odor that instantly smells like a high-end mountain cabin.
To ensure that builders, architects, and homeowners all over the world get exactly what they pay for this wood goes through a highly specific, rigorous grading system. This system is overseen primarily by the Western Wood Products Association, or the WWPA. When a massive Ponderosa log is milled into boards, those boards are visually inspected and grouped into three main commercial categories.
Let's walk through those grades. If I go to a lumberyard, what am I looking at?
First, you have the selects. This is the absolute top-tier premium grade. This is the perfectly clear wood with virtually no knots, no blemishes, and perfectly straight grain. It is highly prized for high-end interior finishing, custom cabinetry, and architectural woodwork, where you want a flawless, unbroken surface.
It's the luxury tier. And then the next step down.
Then you have the commons. These are your general-purpose boards where you actively see the knots and the natural character of the tree. When you picture classic, cozy, knotty pine paneling in a den or a ceiling, you are looking at commons grades.
But the most fascinating category from a manufacturing standpoint is the factory and shop grades. These are often referred to in the timber industry as the economical clears. They aren't meant to be used as whole boards. They are specifically cut for remanufacturing.
Exactly. A factory-grade board might have several large knots or defects scattered along its length. But the mills use advanced scanning technology to calculate exactly how many clear, knot-free, standard-sized, smaller pieces can be ripped and cross-cut out of the spaces between the knots on a single board. This is the hidden grade that the entire world uses to manufacture the intricate parts of fine wooden doors, window frames, and plantation shutters.
And the reason window and door manufacturers specifically obsess over Ponderosa pine is a physical property called dimensional stability. Because the Ponderosa grows relatively slowly and has a very uniform cellular structure across its growth rings. The wood physically shrinks and swells very little compared to other softwoods when the ambient humidity changes in a house.
That is critical for a window. If you build a precision window frame out of it, it's going to stay perfectly square and tight. It won't dramatically warp, twist, or bind in the frame when the seasons change from a humid summer to a dry winter. It also resists splitting when you drive a nail or a screw near the edge of a board, making it an absolute dream material for fine cabinet makers and carpenters.
It also excels in heavy-duty outdoor applications. Treated Ponderosa pine is incredibly popular for outdoor decking, heavily utilizing what the WWPA calls the Patio 82 grades. And its success as a decking material goes all the way back to that incredibly wide band of sapwood we mentioned earlier.
The cellular structure of Ponderosa sapwood is uniquely porous. It acts almost like a hard sponge. This allows chemical preservatives to penetrate deeply, completely, and uniformly throughout the entire thickness of the board when it is pressure treated. With many other commercial softwood species like Douglas fir, the cellular structure is so tight that the liquid preservatives cannot naturally soak in deeply enough to protect the center of the wood from rot.
So how do they treat those other woods if they are too tight?
To get the preservatives into a Douglas fir board, mills have to use an aggressive mechanical process called incising. They run the boards through massive metal rollers covered in sharp teeth that physically perforate or punch thousands of tiny slit-like holes all over the surface of the wood. This forces the chemicals in, but it leaves the wood looking chewed up and heavily textured. Ponderosa pine naturally absorbs the treatment so well it doesn't need to be incised at all, leaving a beautifully smooth, pristine surface for a barefoot backyard deck.
Before we leave the commercial side of this deep dive, there is this quirky aesthetic phenomenon detailed in the research that we have to mention. It's called the blue stain. If a ponderosa is logged in the woods and the freshly felled green timber is left sitting on the ground and gets too warm before it is properly transported and kiln dried, a naturally occurring fungus moves in. This fungus causes the sapwood to develop a very distinct, streaky blue or grayish stain running throughout the grain.
The absolutely critical point here from an engineering standpoint is that this blue stain fungus feeds entirely on the sugars in the sap. It does not eat the cellulose of the wood itself. Therefore, it does not affect the structural strength, the hardness, or the durability of the wood whatsoever. It is an entirely cosmetic alteration.
Which is fascinating because while a massive blue streak might downgrade the lumber for a buyer looking for a pristine, pure white piece of trim, many modern interior designers and custom builders actually actively seek it out. They hunt for blue pine. They intentionally enhance the blue stain with clear finishes to create a very specific, highly desired rustic farmhouse or custom cabin aesthetic. What was once considered a grading defect that lowered the price has effectively become a premium design feature.
It's just another brilliant example of how every single aspect of this tree, even its interactions with fungi, finds a unique, valuable purpose in the ecosystem and in human hands.
Okay, we've covered a truly massive amount of ground today. We've gone from the microscopic genetics to the global timber market. Let's do a quick recap to solidify the incredible journey of the Ponderosa pine.
It begins with a tiny, fragile seed facing almost insurmountable mathematical odds dropped into a harsh environment. It relies on a rapid, deep-diving taproot to beat the lethal summer drought of the American West. As it matures, it slowly grows into a thick-barked, self-pruning fortress, a physical structure specifically engineered to shed the intense heat of historical low-intensity wildfires. Throughout its long life, it wages a constant invisible chemical war against over 100 species of aggressive insect predators and parasitic plants. And finally, after centuries of slow, resilient, stoic growth, it is sustainably harvested and meticulously milled into the incredibly stable, beautiful, vanilla-scented wood products that build our homes, our decks, and our furniture.
So to you listening right now, the next time you open a smoothly gliding honeytone pine drawer in your kitchen, or the next time you are lucky enough to take a hike through a dry western mountain forest and you catch that sweet, surprising smell of butterscotch baking in the sun, take a second. Stop and remember that you're experiencing the direct, tangible results of thousands of years of brutal, brilliant, highly specialized evolutionary survival.
It truly is a living, breathing monument to the power of adaptation.
I want to leave you with a final provocative thought to mull over on your own as you go about your day. We spent a lot of time today talking about how the Ponderosa pine evolved its most signature traits: the thick fire-shedding puzzle piece bark, the high self-pruning branches, the heat-resistant foliage, as a direct biological response to the immense evolutionary pressure of frequent low-intensity wildfires over millennia. But as we've seen through the tree ring data in ecological history, human intervention over the last century has fundamentally altered the frequency, the intensity, and the severity of those fires in many places across the continent. So herein the question: if we permanently change the specific fire environment that physically created this tree, what does the evolutionary future of the Ponderosa pine look like? Hundreds or thousands of years from now, without the specific type of creeping surface fire that forged its armor, will the grand park-like giant of the West eventually evolve into something completely unrecognizable? Think about it. Thanks for taking the deep dive.